This is Chapter 5, Section 2, The Dynamics of Rebellion from 1765 to 1766. So we'll start with the formal protest and the politics of the crowd. So the Stamp Act Congress. In Section 1, you were introduced to the Stamp Act and how it placed a tax on all printed items in the colonies, and the colonists had to purchase stamps to put on any type of printed item. And it was the first direct tax from Britain on the colonists themselves. The Sugar Act had been a tariff, so it doesn't really count as a direct tax. So before the Stamp Act Congress actually happens, several different groups of protesters started to organize in the colonies that were against the Stamp Act and the Sugar Act and all the different things that Britain was trying to do to the colonists. So we start to get this idea of patriots. Patriots are defenders of American rights. And these patriots organized protests, they rioted, and they articulated an ideology of resistance. Well, several colonial assemblies issued formal protests condemning the Stamp Act as a violation of American freedoms. And 9 colonies sent delegates to what's called the Stamp Act Congress in 1765. It met in New York City in October 1765. And they issued a list of grievances about the Sugar and Stamp Acts to Parliament. They said that these acts were unconstitutional because it was not imposed by elected colonial representatives. And they said that the right to trial by jury was taken away from them with the Vice Admiralty courts. They said that they didn't want conflict with Britain, they just wanted a compromise. And so they began and concluded their list of grievances by pledging their allegiance to the king and Britain. If they didn't do that, it might have seemed like they were in a state of rebellion and Britain could have had them captured and tried for treason. So they wanted to make it clear that they were loyal to the king and to Britain. They just have these complaints and we would like to work them out. That was a pretty non-confrontational approach to dealing with all these things coming out of Britain. But there were also some other ways of dealing with Britain that were pretty confrontational. Not all colonists were the peaceful, non-confrontational type. So some colonial leaders encouraged a boycott of British goods. That was pretty confrontational. But also a new group of patriots formed called the Sons of Liberty. The Sons of Liberty was a resistance group, and they were organized by Samuel Adams, who is the cousin of John Adams. The Sons of Liberty were very radical, and they used terrorist tactics like burning down houses or tarring and feathering tax collectors. Or they would mutilate tax collectors in effigy, which means that they would create this statue of them or some sort of fake representation that looked like a tax collector, and then they destroy it. It was just meant as a message to the tax collectors. But they encouraged the resignation of these tax collectors, and they destroyed the property of supporters of imperial authority. Here's Sam Adams' grave in Boston. The motives of the crowd. So rioting and protest in the colonies was not a new idea. It was just the idea of their cause was new. Rioting and protest had been going on for a while, but their cause was new. The colonists joined this mob for different reasons. Some feared the new imperial system would take away their liberties. Others, like artisans, joined the mob because the cheaper manufactured British goods threatened their businesses in America. There were also some who joined because they resented British arrogance. They just didn't like the British. And then others were just young men seeking adventure. Rioting was fun and exciting to them, and so they joined the crowd. So where did these roots of resistance come from? Where did they get these ideas that they had the right to protest their government? The initial American protest focused on mostly economic and political matters. But eventually, patriot lawyers and publicists also provided the resistance movement with an intellectual rationale, a political agenda, and a visible team of leaders. So initial protests were based on economic issues, but the idea of liberty began to emerge over time. The fact that you can break away from your mother country. And so the colonists began to focus on the natural rights of all people. Patriot leaders pulled their ideas from 3 different intellectual resources. The first one was English common law. These are the laws that protect the king's subjects. In English common law, there's something called the writ of assistance. It says that English officials were allowed to search colonist property with only this writ of assistance, which is a general warrant that allowed the British officials to search any and all colonist homes. They didn't have to have a specific house, a specific warrant for a specific house or person. It was just a common writ of assistance. They could go and search anybody's house in the colonies if they needed to. And then there was also the idea of the vice admiralty courts. The Magna Carta had established the right to a trial by jury. And the colonists were thinking that this isn't fair. We're not getting a trial by jury with these vice admiralty courts. So they're looking at this English common law and looking at the idea that they're not, with the writ of assistance and with the vice admiralty courts, they're not getting the same rights as the British citizens on the mainland Britain are getting. The second intellectual resource was the Enlightenment. We've talked about John Locke before and his idea of natural rights and contract theory. And so the colonists are, really into John Locke, and they're looking at his ideas and thinking that they make a whole lot of sense. If our government is oppressive, we can get rid of them. If they are not respecting our natural rights, we can oppose them. And so they're starting to use this reason to question the social injustices that Britain is imposing upon them. But besides John Locke, who we've talked about in the past, there's also some ideas coming from another philosopher named Montesquieu. His idea was the separation of powers. And it said that, you have to have different parts of the government have different powers so that not one person or one government entity gets too powerful. And so they're looking at that idea as well and using it in their resistance and in their promotion of a possible rebellion. And then the third resource they look at is the English political past. Patriot leaders used arguments against political corruption taken from the English against the monarchy during movements in England itself. So they're looking in the past and saying, when did this happen before? When was the government oppressive before and someone else overthrew that government and established a new rule? And their biggest example at this time was the Glorious Revolution, when they believed King James II was being oppressive and he was overthrown by his daughter Mary and William of Orange, and people in Britain celebrated that. And so they're looking at that as an example of it's happened before, it was celebrated, maybe it can happen again. So the leaders in the colonies, the Patriot leaders, were able to publish and circulate their ideas in pamphlets mostly, which basically turned just this series of riots and tax protests into a legitimate political movement. It became more organized, and it gave them a backing rather than just, we're angry about these taxes. So Parliament compromises in 1766. Prime Minister Grenville was replaced in 1765 by Lord Rockingham. Grenville, by the way, was dismissed by King George. Lord Rockingham opposed Grenville's tough policies toward the colonists. He thought they were too harsh. There were some factions in Parliament that also favored a repeal of some of these taxes for various reasons. Some believed that the American colonies were more valuable for commerce than they were for revenue-raising taxes. And so if you just keep taxing them and they eventually break away or they're boycotting your goods, then you're not getting the business. And they're more profitable for business than they are if you're just trying to raise taxes. Other people believe that these new taxes were in fact unconstitutional, that the colonists weren't getting representation, so they should not be taxed. And of course, the British merchants favored repealing the taxes because of the colonial boycotts. They were hurting the merchants' business. So in 1766, Rockingham decided to repeal the Stamp Act. The colonial boycott of British goods had pretty much just hurt the merchants, so he wanted to pacify them and help them, but he also wanted to pacify the colonists, so maybe this idea of rebellion would go away. He also changed the Sugar Act. Remember the tax on French molasses? The tax was actually further reduced. He still left the tax there, but he made it even smaller. It was very minuscule now at this point. So the crown still made money because it was a tax, even as small as it was, and the financial burden on the colonists then was reduced. But in 1706, he also had Parliament pass the Declaratory Act. And it said that Parliament had the right to pass laws on the American colonies. So it was the Declaratory Act is basically like, if we want to pass taxes and acts on you, we can. That is our right. You cannot obstruct that. You cannot protest that. We don't happen to want to pass any taxes on you right now. We're going to reduce the Stamp Act, or we're going to get rid of the Stamp Act. We're going to reduce the Sugar Act. But just so you know, in the future, if we want to pass taxes on you, we can. So they're declaring their right to pass taxes. That's why it's called the Declaratory Act. So at this point, there's still hope of working out a relationship that both England and the colonies could accept, with Lord Rockingham as the Prime Minister being more compromising, people in Parliament, people in Britain actually wanting to compromise with the colonists. It looks like maybe we can work out a peace.